Kenya's streets have turned into battlegrounds over the past weeks, with young protesters clashing with police over new tax proposals. But this isn't just about taxes, it's a fight for economic survival. We'll uncover the deeper issues fueling this conflict. The protests in Kenya have reached a boiling point, with thousands of citizens taking to the streets across the nation. The government's proposed tax bill has ignited widespread anger, leading to violent confrontations between protesters and authorities. Reports indicate that police have used excessive force, including live ammunition, resulting in fatalities and injuries. At the heart of this turmoil lies a complex economic crisis. The government argues that new taxes are necessary to reduce national debt and repay lenders. However, protesters claim these measures will worsen poverty and increase the cost of living. The stakes are high, with the future of Kenya's economy hanging in the balance. As we explore this conflict, we'll examine the factors driving both sides and the potential consequences for the nation. The government's proposed finance bill has become the flashpoint for Kenya's current unrest. But what exactly does this controversial bill contain, and why has it sparked such fierce opposition? Let's break down the key elements of this tax proposal and examine how it would impact everyday Kenyans. At its core, the finance bill aims to raise $2.7 billion in additional taxes. This ambitious target is driven by pressure from international lenders like the International Monetary Fund to increase revenues and reduce Kenya's national debt. To achieve this goal, the government has proposed several significant tax changes. One of the most contentious aspects of the bill is the plan to double the value-added tax on petroleum products from 8% to 16%. This change would have far-reaching consequences for Kenyans, as it would likely lead to increased transportation costs and higher prices for many goods. The agricultural sector, which relies heavily on fuel for machinery and transportation, would be particularly affected, potentially driving up food prices across the country. The bill also introduces new taxes on imported goods such as phones, computers, and motorcycles. These taxes could make essential technology and transportation options more expensive for many Kenyans, potentially hindering economic growth and mobility. Another controversial element is the proposed taxation of digital services and content creation. This move could impact Kenya's growing digital economy and potentially discourage innovation in this sector. It's worth noting that the government has already dropped some initially proposed taxes due to public backlash. These included a 16% VAT on bread, a tax on sanitary products, and a 2.5% tax on motor vehicles. However, many Kenyans feel that the remaining proposals still place an unfair burden on low-income citizens. The bill also introduces a 1.5% housing levy, which critics argue is an additional strain on the working class. So why is the government pushing for these measures? The answer lies in Kenya's substantial national debt. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of approximately 70%, the government argues that increasing taxes is necessary to reduce reliance on borrowing and meet the country's financial obligations. President William Ruto's administration contends that these measures are crucial for Kenya's long-term economic stability. They argue that by raising more tax revenue, they can reduce the need for further borrowing and begin to address the country's debt burden. However, critics and protesters argue that this approach places an undue strain on an already economically burdened population. Many young Kenyans, facing high unemployment rates, feel that these taxes will further exacerbate their financial struggles. The bill has been described by protesters as punishing the poor, reflecting a widespread sentiment that it disproportionately affects those least able to bear additional costs. As the protests continue, it remains to be seen whether a compromise can be reached that addresses both the country's fiscal needs and the concerns of its citizens. The government's stance is clear, but what about the people on the streets? To understand the full picture, we need to examine the protesters' perspective and the factors driving their anger. The main grievances of the protesters go beyond just the new taxes. High unemployment, inflation, and widespread poverty are fueling discontent. With a third of the country living in poverty, many view the additional taxes as unfairly punishing those who are already struggling. The removal of subsidies on essential items has led to price spikes for basic commodities like bread and maize flour, further straining household budgets. Protesters argue that the government has mismanaged funds and failed to address corruption effectively. They believe that the debt incurred hasn't been invested in productive areas but wasted on recurrent expenditure and corrupt activities. This sentiment of betrayal is particularly strong among young Kenyans, who feel the government has broken its campaign promises to help them. Social media has played a crucial role in mobilizing protesters, especially young Kenyans. Platforms like TikTok have become powerful tools for organizing demonstrations and spreading awareness. Protesters use these platforms to live stream events and coordinate their efforts, enhancing their ability to mobilize quickly and effectively. The demographics of the protesters are noteworthy. Many participants are teens or in their early 20s, representing Gen Z and millennials. These young Kenyans are driven by the direct impact of the taxes on their lives and a desire for a better future. They're not just calling for the removal of new taxes, they're demanding greater accountability and action against corruption. Economic expert Reginald Kutu explains the impact of the proposed taxes. When you start taxing bread, edible oil, fuel, you go to every individual, because as long as you consume, then you will pay tax. This statement highlights how the new taxes would affect all aspects of daily life, from food to transportation. The protests have evolved beyond a simple reaction to new taxes. They represent a broader frustration with economic mismanagement and a demand for systemic change. Protesters believe the government should focus on cutting unnecessary expenditures and implementing austerity measures rather than burdening citizens with additional taxes. Initially, the protests were largely peaceful. However, the use of live ammunition by police, resulting in fatalities and injuries, has further fueled the anger and determination of the protesters. This escalation of force has transformed what began as an economic protest into a wider movement against perceived government oppression. It's important to note that these protests are not politically led. They represent a grassroots movement driven by citizens' desire for economic justice and a better future. The use of social media has allowed protesters to organize without traditional political structures, creating a decentralized but powerful force. The protesters' perspective reveals a complex web of economic and social issues underlying the current unrest in Kenya. Understanding these factors is crucial for grasping the full scope of the crisis and the challenges facing both the government and the citizens as they seek a resolution. As tensions escalate between protesters and authorities, the streets of Kenya have become battlegrounds. The clash between these forces has taken a violent turn, with reports of excessive force and human rights violations emerging. Understanding the nature of these confrontations is crucial to grasping the full scope of the crisis. The protests against the finance bill have intensified, leading to violent encounters between police and demonstrators. Authorities have employed a range of tactics to disperse crowds, including live ammunition, rubber bullets, tear gas, and water cannons. These aggressive measures have drawn sharp criticism from human rights organizations and the public alike. Amnesty International Kenya has raised alarm over multiple reports of human rights violations. There are allegations that police have abducted prominent Kenyans and detained protesters unlawfully. These actions, if true, represent a serious breach of civil liberties and democratic principles. The consequences of these clashes have been severe. Reports indicate that at least 13 people have lost their lives, with dozens more injured in the latest round of protests. These casualties have further inflamed public sentiment and intensified calls for accountability. President William Ruto has taken a hardline stance on the protests, labeling them as treasonous. He stated, "It is not in order or even conceivable that criminals pretending to be peaceful protesters can rain terror against the people, their elected representatives, and the institutions established under our Constitution, and expect to go scot-free." This characterization of protesters as criminals has further widened the divide between the government and its critics. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International Kenya, the Kenya Medical Association, and the Law Society of Kenya, have unequivocally condemned the use of live fire by police. These organizations are calling for an immediate halt to the use of lethal force against protesters, emphasizing the need for peaceful resolution. The impact of this violence on public sentiment has been profound. There is widespread condemnation of the police's heavy-handed tactics, with many viewing these actions as an abuse of power. The use of force has not only failed to quell the protests, but has instead galvanized more people to join the cause. The intensity of the confrontations was starkly illustrated when protesters stormed the Kenyan parliament. Parts of the building were set on fire, causing significant damage. lawmakers were forced to flee through underground tunnels for safety, underscoring the gravity of the situation. The unrest in Kenya has drawn international attention. Global organizations like the United Nations and various foreign embassies have called for restraint and urged peaceful dialogue. These international voices add pressure on both the government and protesters to find a peaceful resolution. In an apparent attempt to limit coverage of the protests, internet disruptions were reported across Kenya and neighboring countries. This move has been seen by many as an effort to control the narrative and restrict the flow of information about events on the ground. It's important to note that the majority of participants in these protests are young people. Many feel that the proposed taxes will exacerbate the already high cost of living, pushing them further into economic hardship. These youth are leveraging social media to coordinate and mobilize, demonstrating the power of digital platforms in modern protest movements. The clash between authorities and protesters in Kenya represents more than just a disagreement over economic policy. It has evolved into a broader conflict about civil rights, government accountability, and the future direction of the nation. As the situation continues to unfold, the actions of both the authorities and the protesters will play a crucial role in shaping Kenya's path forward. The clash between protesters and authorities highlights a deeper dilemma facing the Kenyan government. How can they balance the need to reduce national debt with the growing public discontent? The government's push for new taxes stems from pressure to meet financial obligations. President William Ruto's administration aims to raise around $2.7 billion through tax hikes to fill the budget gap and reduce external debt. This move is partly driven by commitments to lenders like China and the International Monetary Fund. However, the proposed 16% value-added tax on petroleum products and other goods has sparked widespread anger. Many Kenyans see these measures as punishing the poor and worsening the cost of living crisis. The broader implications for democratic processes in Africa are also a concern. The excessive use of force against peaceful protesters can undermine democratic principles and potentially fuel further unrest in the region. This situation serves as a warning to other African nations about the delicate balance between maintaining order and respecting citizens' rights to peaceful protest. Former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta's statement emphasizes the importance of dialogue in resolving the current crisis. He urged the leadership to embrace dialogue and speak to the people, not at them, highlighting the democratic principles at stake in this conflict. The international community's response to Kenya's situation reflects a growing concern about the stability of democratic institutions in Africa. As Kenya navigates this crisis, the actions of its government and the resolution of these protests will be closely watched by global actors. The outcome could set a precedent for how similar situations are handled across the continent, potentially influencing the trajectory of democratic development in other African nations. As Kenya's economic crisis deepens, finding a resolution becomes increasingly challenging. The nation faces a critical crossroads, with the government and protesters seemingly at an impasse. To move forward, both sides must navigate complex obstacles and seek common ground. President Ruto has offered to engage in dialogue, but the lack of centralized protest leadership complicates negotiations. Protesters demand the complete withdrawal of the finance bill, while the government insists on the necessity of new taxes to address Kenya's debt. The long-term implications of this conflict are significant. Continued unrest could deter foreign investment and hinder economic growth. Conversely, pushing through unpopular tax measures risks further social instability. Kenya's political and economic future hinges on finding a balanced solution that addresses both fiscal needs and public concerns. The path to resolution requires compromise and creative problem-solving from all parties involved.